The Will to Knowledge is a fragment of a vast body of work produced by French theorist Michel Foucault. And although Foucault didn't really seem to care much officially about world politics, his work has been used a lot by people who do. Foucault is considered many things and is often described as a post-structuralist. To some people, this signals stop listening, and post-structural analysis in politics and international relations has been accused of many not very nice things. These include abstractionism, ahistoricism, apoliticism, a lack of real-world application, and obscuring the so-called material conditions of world politics. These criticisms are pervasive and often levied at post-structuralists. But post-structuralists also take heart in knowing that such criticisms stem from the sort of effort to discipline the production of knowledge that Foucault was so good at critiquing. One of Foucault's key contributions to the study of world politics has been a focus on understanding the technical machinery, to use his own words, regulating people's lives. This includes all kinds of institutions of governance, including schools, universities, hospitals, prisons, welfare systems, the judiciary, police, and so on. In trying to unsettle embedded and privileged systems of authority, there will always be substantial kickback. Perhaps next time you hear criticisms of post-structural work, if you ever do, think about what might be at stake for someone who is threatened by a post-structural understanding of power, knowledge, economic systems, and sexuality. Foucault is often considered a founding voice of discourse analysis in political science and international relations. This is an approach to research that focuses on the interrelationship between power and knowledge and how this relationship is embodied in the systems of meaning through which we know ourselves and each other. Discourse analysis examines how each of us is enmeshed in a matrix, or matrices plural, through which we understand our social existence and are able to act within it, what we can and cannot do, what we believe to be feasible, how we can or think we can act, how we identify ourselves and others, and pursue our lives. Such matrices might relate to economic production, security, health, education, the judicial system, medicine, and so on, and of course all of these simultaneously. Foucault wasn't consistent in his use of the term discourse, however, and in fact he rarely defined the term. He also produced an anthology of writing that internally varied quite hugely over his lifetime. But he did say some things that are quite significant in engaging with the world around us, and especially in The Will to Knowledge, created a space for thinking imaginatively and subversively about human sexuality. The Will to Knowledge constitutes Volume 1 of Foucault's The History of Sexuality and was first published in 1976 in France, translated in 1978, 6 years before its author's death. Foucault at this point was a big-name scholar and public intellectual, but the text was exceedingly controversial. In The Incitement to Discourse, Foucault analyses how a 17th century age of repression was able to enforce a particular regime of sexuality. What has been called biopolitics entails a strategy begun by Foucault for understanding and deconstructing the practices and processes through which bodies are governed by various regimes of knowledge, power, and authority. For Foucault, the mechanisms of power are constantly provoked endlessly to analyse, stocktake, classify, specify, and quantify as an exercise of power. This is especially evident in The Incitement to Discourse. Biopolitics is how we are governed. In fact, governance only works by regulating human bodies, although a lot of politics and international relations forget that human bodies are their core business. A highly intrusive but commanding discourse of acceptable sex is a pretty good way of ensuring your population behaves itself. This entails substantial effort, saying and not saying things about sex, allowing and disallowing types of speaker, authorizing and prohibiting types of discussion. A lot of work goes into making something like sexuality and sex seem invisible, so much a basic function of society that they need not be talked about. For Foucault, this is the biggest clue about how much apparently trivial details preoccupy the structures of authority. In the case of sexuality, or the desire to seek out sexual activity, we need only consider the extent to which our bodies must be checked, tested and modified, regularly and constantly, and through precepts, opinions, observations, medical advice, clinical cases, outlines for reform, plans for ideal institutions, and so on. As a gender theorist, when I use Foucault's writing, I do so in the knowledge that Foucault did not discuss gender directly, nor did he self-articulate, as far as I know, as a feminist. He did hang out with Simone de Beauvoir, however, and is clearly sympathetic to feminist concerns in a number of his writings. What he did do was provide a lot of work outlining the generally constraining effects of power-laden discourses, such as compulsory heterosexuality, and the constitutive and discursively regulated relationship between the identity categories of sex and gender. Foucault's writing was, at the time of its publication, perhaps most controversial because he dared to suggest that sexuality, and therefore heterosexuality, was constructed and deployed in the name of social control by legal, medical, and governmental authorities invested in regulating people's bodies. This is what makes Foucault's work so important to a lot of gender and queer work in politics and IR. For Foucault, the body, including its sex, gender, and sexuality, are cultural constructs rather than natural facts. This has been especially important to queer approaches and feminist critiques of gender essentialism. Foucault's discussion of the relationship between power, the body, and sexuality has inspired work that has shown how straight, white discourses of governance have repressed and constrained bodies in various pernicious and totalizing ways throughout history. Following Foucault, it becomes harder to see the truth of sex as anything other than a regulatory fiction, deployed for multiple ends by agencies of power and imposed through multiple forms of discourse, coded contents, and qualified speakers. This is a controversial point, and not all feminists deconstruct the category of sex in this way. It has been a useful device in my work for understanding how assumptions about people, including their unique biology, feed into dominating powerful systems and practices of governance, such as global finance, development strategy, and neoliberal policy making. If you believe that sex and gender are fixed and map onto each other, however, you might struggle with Foucault, but it is still worth questioning where particular gendered assumptions come from, such as assumptions about men as naturally risk-taking or women as intrinsically nurturing and less corrupt, and how they work to prescribe policy initiatives such as microfinance, post-crisis austerity, or post-conflict reconstruction. For Foucault, power is not a group of institutions and mechanisms or a single mode of subjugation. It is not a general system of domination. It is less the obvious workings of government, authority, and dominance than a complex and variable, productive and repressive, innate and intimate quality to human relationships. Power is everywhere, and relations of power for Foucault are mobile. Quote, they can be modified, they are not fixed once and for all, end quote. This might not seem a terribly significant contribution until we consider what IR, for example, has often said about power. IR has long tended to elevate abstracted engagements with the state as a unit bouncing off and occasionally pointing weapons at other units in the international system. Only really in its thickest constructivist, post-structural and gender forms does IR say much about the everyday, intimate experiences of power and how they are regulated through discourses of social control, often to quite horrible social, political and economic effect. But when we start to think about power as intimate and everywhere, we start to think of everything as potentially significant, not just states, politicians and nuclear capability, but the little things that don't pass muster on the evening news or in academic textbooks. Things like the foul working conditions for Sri Lankan women working in export processing zones, racialized poverty in so-called rich countries, or higher rates of suicide among homo or bisexual youths in liberal and not so liberal societies. This isn't to say that power is not big, all-encompassing and obvious. For Foucault, the political sphere is entirely constituted and made possible by discursively constituted, pervasive and real systems of coercion. So, for example, particular regimes of truth, such as neoliberal economic theory, drive economic practices, such as trade, profit, accumulation and production, and these appear to follow naturally from the state of things, but they are actually, as Foucault describes, a, quote, multiplicity of force relations, end quote, dependent on various contingent elements, such as government, law, debt, the longevity of financial ideas, and so on. Remember also that Foucault was writing during the birth of neoliberalism in the 1970s. Neoliberalism has become one of the most all-defining, diffuse, and apparently unassailable economic systems humans have ever lived through. Foucault understood intuitively what many would sadly come to experience. Neoliberalism is not laissez-faire, an economic politics of letting the market rather than government govern itself. Neoliberalism, the harbinger of deregulation, was and is permanent vigilance, intervention and hyper-regulation. It has been so successful because neoliberal actors have been able to install as common sense narratives of economic practice that are the product of elite and contingent histories of white colonization. And so order for Foucault is omnipresent. It is what gives discourses like neoliberalism, which might otherwise look a bit contingent and unstable, their power. When we start to challenge the coherence of, for example, economic systems, however, we see how they are historically conditioned, institutionalized, and imbued with order, regularity, and discipline, which they reproduce by conditioning the human bodies that they govern. And we begin to open a space for resisting these discourses and their key actors. Justice for Foucault, as for many post-structuralists, is a product of particular relations of power. It is experienced differently by different people according to their position in society, their history, their presentation of race, gender, culture, class, and so on. And so justice is also culturally and historically contingent. Foucault would, I think, most likely caution us to pay attention to how justice is used or not used to exert control over bodies, rather than assume it is a thing that exists in the world, independent of the social mechanisms of power and authority through which it is channeled. I would like to think that Foucault would argue that we can always fight for change from a post-structural view. The task for post-structuralists now is to think carefully about how we benefit from particular systems of authority, power and privilege before we commit to unravelling them.